Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
The lady is my mistress. I lack nothing. She makes me lie down in green pastures. She leads me beside quiet waters. She refreshes my soul. She guides me along the secret paths for her name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the dead, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your key and torches, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all of the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of magic forever. Amen. That was a rewritten version of Psalm 23. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is the podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent topics and concepts, exploring the intersections of magic, science, art, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Estrada, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show, and magic for that matter, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I don't speak for anybody but myself. People can, will, and should disagree sometimes with the things that I or my guests have to say on this show. How we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things, after all, anyway. And like those who attempt to be reasonable should be willing to do, I can and often will revise my opinions or thoughts about things based on new evidence. Very excited to share this special episode with you all. I spoke with Tom Banger, host of the Banger and Andrew podcast. We also headed the Temple of Psychic Youth in North America back in the day. We talked about the history, magic, and adventures of the temple. Topi has been a big influence and inspiration for many modern magicians, occultists, and artists. You might be familiar with Coil or Current 93, groups like that, and things like experimenting with language, the cut-up technique, sigil magic, using sexual fluids, and challenging ideas about identity and gender and things like that. These are all associated with the Temple of Psychic Youth's work. The Pandragyne experiment that Topi founder Genesis P. Orridge and partner Lady J undertook to become more similar to each other in physical appearance is a touchstone for many when it comes to the notion of liberation through body modification. The influence that Topi had on modern occultism is sort of just now beginning to be unpacked. Topi's work has also been a big influence on me, magically. I've experimented with the sigil of 3 liquids for honestly longer than the 23 months originally required to initiate oneself into the temple, and I've come to some interesting understandings about what's going on with it behind the curtains as like a piece of magical tech. Some of what Tom shares today also allowed a few pieces of that puzzle to fall into place for me, and I think that some of the concerns that I have regarding the way that it's originally written up in the Greybook are probably indeed justified. It's a dope piece of magical tech, and there are a few things I think that just need to be updated about it to make it a little more functional. Kinky people are aware that not all fantasies should be brought into reality. Some things are better off living in the mind, bringing fantasy, intent, desire, etc. down from the realm of the imagination into the realm of meat world space is the work of kinksters, magicians, and artists and creators of all types. Having some of the wisdom and ability to discern between which things should be brought into meat world and which should stay in the world of the mind is an important detail, which I feel maybe the original tech kind of overlooks a little bit. This is getting into some serious weeds, though. Apologies. Hit me up at luxoccultpod@gmail.com if you would like to discuss the nuances of all of this stuff. There's always several sides to any story, as everybody knows. As important and influential were the magical contributions made by Topi. If we look at the Wikipedia article about them, you'll see that there have also been some criticisms about the way that some parts of the temple were run and about how issues like gender and consent were dealt with. And we're going to address some of that in today's conversation, as well as looking at the things that made Topi's work so impactful. I'll also share an update about what we have going on with the Green Mushroom Project, a large-scale group working which you can be a part of, and Void House, our newest adventure in creating consent-forward magical spaces for group work, both in person and online, and investigating the magical healing and alchemical properties of consent while providing consent education opportunities to magically inclined people. Whew. I have a lot of good stuff to get into here today. I'm also going to share a few thoughts during a break about some of my own experiences working in magical groups and stuff like that. I'll remind you real quick, though, if you like the show or the other work I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you can take a Bibliomancy break with me. There are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Buy me a coffee is an option for those who wish to show their support with a one-time donation. Thank you so much to all of you who are already doing so. Your support makes the show possible by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, thereby justifying to myself the not inconsiderable amount of time I spend. I appreciate the opportunity to be making this thing, and to have the resources necessary to reach you all today is a huge part of that. So many thanks to the support, which is making all of this possible. I'm a very introverted person, and I don't use social media too much because of this. It's a lot. Not there checking on it every day or anything like that, but that certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com. You can still find me on Instagram at Lux Occult Pod. I'm not sure how long that's going to last or not, though. But you can also find me on Blue Sky at Luxstrata, LuxAstrata. I think it's 919. But yes, you'll see me there. And that is a great place to keep up with me for the show. So let me go ahead and set the table with some context about today's conversation. Last year, when I announced our plans for Void House, Green Mushroom Project's newest adventure in creating a consent-forward space, as I said a second ago, Tom Banger let me know that he was really into this idea and he was wondering how he could help out, and I really appreciate that. And as a side note, I want to say that I appreciate all of the help that we've been getting on this so far. The Consent Academy has been a huge and valuable resource. Check out their work at theconsentacademy.com. Just the other day, I hosted a workshop about trauma-informed practices for consensual group magic with former trauma-informed crisis worker Dave Neal, who you can hear in episodes 26 and 42, and who reached out to me to ask about helping out with our Void House and consent magic efforts. Education and finding shared language to talk about the things we need to talk about to build strong, trusting relationships and magical partnerships to explore the liminal space of consent, this void, together, is a huge part of this. You can check out a recording of that workshop on the Lux Occult YouTube channel. In addition to these educational efforts, we've also been trying to get as many perspectives as possible so that what we're creating can be as healthy and robust as possible. As I say, we'll see how it goes. Nothing will ever be perfect, but having ways to improve things when things inevitably go wrong seems like a key factor in any venture's success. I've been involved in situations where it was assumed that since the people in the group all felt like they were totally perfect, no notes, whatever, nothing could possibly go wrong due to how excellent everybody supposedly was. So why bother with procedures and systems at all? We're kind of taking an opposite approach and assuming that no matter how awesome we are or how awesome we think we are, shit is complicated and mistakes will be made. And it's one's ability to account for, take accountability for, and learn and improve from one's mistakes that is a measure of strength and competence, not one's ability to delude themselves and others about the nature of said mistakes or about them happening in the first place. And the more that we can learn from others, the better. So when Tom offered this help, I said that it would be really valuable if he would allow me to pick his brain about his experiences being an organizer for Topi. I was curious to hear about what worked and what didn't, what he learned along the way, and what he would pass on to future magicians in similar circumstances. When we recorded, we weren't sure if the conversation would be something that we would end up sharing on the show or not, which you might pick up from a few comments which are made here and there. I was really happy when Tom agreed to let me share it here on the show as part of this episode with you all, so gratitude for that. We discussed the idea of cults today, which is a super complicated and interesting topic, and I think a really, really timely one with some of the things and dynamics that we see happening in a lot of different spheres of culture, but I think politics is a huge place right now where we can look at how some of these dynamics play out. The term cult alone is incredibly loaded. There's a few resources related to unpacking the term and the dynamic that it refers to in the show notes. Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships by Janja Lalick is a really good one. There, the term cult can also refer to abusive relationship dynamics, which can function kind of like a cult of one. The term cult can also refer to a wide variety of situations and can be meant as a positive, playful, or simply descriptive way to reference a group. It can also be a pejorative to cast aspersions. I've heard some Christian people say they think Catholics aren't Christians because they're cultists who follow the cult pope leader and not someone else. Cult can also describe creepy, psychologically unhealthy, or abusive situations and dynamics, and there's a whole lot of gray area involved in all of it. One touchstone that keeps coming up in all of the stuff that I've been looking at is consent. And if you're curious about unpacking this stuff, as I said, I put some resources in the show notes. Tom and I get into some pretty nuanced and vulnerable territory at a few points in our conversation, and I very much appreciate Tom's candor and generosity in being willing to unpack all this with me. In my experience, not everybody has the fortitude to look back into the past with the eye of improving the future, and I respect the people who have the strength to do it. So thank you so much, Tom, for the help and for all of it. There's a lot to be learned from today's chat. Tom explains how, although Topi is often lumped in with chaos magic, there's some differences in approach that can be identified. We get into consent, organizational structure, what worked well and what didn't, and much, much more. It's a fun trip down the rabbit hole and memory lane that I think a lot of people who, like me, who have been inspired by the work that Topi did will really, really enjoy. Alright, fuck yeah. As I said, I'll be back during a break to share an update about the Green Mushroom Project and Void House, as well as a few thoughts about some of my experiences. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. Here is the first part of my chat with Tom Banger. Well, this is Lux Estrada here. It's the 14th of May, 2024, and I'm here with Tom Banger. I really appreciate you taking the time to, talk about your experiences with group magic with me. For context, for anybody that might be listening to this in the future, I'm beginning a project called Void House, which is an experiment about creating a consent-forward, inclusive space in which to do group magic. A big component of this is going to be educational offerings about what is consent and what are the nuances of it and how do you know that you have it and what does that look like applied to magical situations and, spotting red flags and abuse tactics. What are some common tactics that cult leaders use? What are some common logical fallacies that can lead people to be misled easily? Thought-stopping cliches, things like that. So I've been doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people. So for context, that is why we are here today. So if you would go ahead and maybe give some similar context for anybody that might hear this in the future about your own experiences and, whatever context you would like to give to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, I'm Tom Banger. The H stands for head because it was a joke a long time ago. I was promoting punk shows, but I was into metal first, so I called my production company Headbanger Presents.
Okay.
And back in those days, your last name became whatever you did.
Okay.
So my last name became Tom Headbanger, and that seemed kind of outdated, and headbanger.com was taken, so I changed my name to Banger.
All right, right on.
That's the history of that. So in 1986, I had an opportunity to tour and do multimedia with Psychick TV, and I had lots of ideas of how to run the Temple of Psychic Youth for North America, get a bulk mailing permit and, send out regular mailers, and people don't know how to buy things internationally, so sell them domestically. I don't think people still would know how to buy things internationally if it wasn't for PayPal. But so I made all these suggestions at the end of the tour, and Genesis Peorage said, well, why don't you just do it then? So I did. And I've started the Temple of Psychic Youth for North America. For those who don't know, the Temple of Psychic Youth was sort of an anti-cult, we called it. Basically, to be a member, in air quotes, all you had to do was somehow put a desire down on paper and then anoint it with sexual fluids, blood, hair from both your top and your bottom, as it were, and spit. It was called the ritual of the three liquids, blood, spit, and what we called of, which was sexual fluids. And then you mailed it to the temple. And so by displaying that trust in an unknown organization, you were essentially initiated into the cult and a member sort of in full standing. So I ran that for North America for 5 years with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of help and lots of support from the UK. And it was interesting because there were sort of two factions. There were those who thought that, saw Genesis Peorage as the leader or spokesman. Genesis at that time was identifying male. So I'll use he for the past for that period, and I'll use she or they for later when they did surgery to become identical to their partner, Jackie. And Genesis Peorage became Genesis Briar Peorage. So it was interesting because I was sort of the center of this cult in North America, and yet was, shall we say, if you were to look at an org chart, you would have Genesis and the UK on top. And then there were three things called stations that were two. There was UK, which was sort of on top. And then you had Europe, which was run by Carl Abrahamson, coordinated, as we said, by Carl Abrahamson, and North America, which was coordinated by myself. And again, there was lots of help. That wasn't a one-person show by any means. So that's kind of my background in that particular cult. And it was interesting because it was deliberately decentralized, especially in the beginning, although there were lots of kind of schisms and disputes and defections and hard feelings as time went on. And some of those are well known probably to people listening, and some of them not so well known.
If you can identify a sort of central theme that led to the schisms or the problems that ended up arising, is there anything that comes up for you?
Well, one is that people wanted to start doing things on their own. I think that's probably true of the Coil folks, for example, John Balance and sleazy Peter Christopherson or Christopherson. His nickname was Sleazy. I'm not calling him sleazy. And then I think David Tibet was involved early on, and he doesn't speak about his involvement at all. But there were also sort of less high-profile folks that just needed to leave. Some of them felt like they'd been exploited in some way. Others just wanted to do their own thing or, moved on. One of the folks from the OTO, actually the caliph of the OTO, called Topi Preschool for ceremonial magicians, which it kind of acted as, in a way, as a method for people to experiment with magic. And a lot of people were drawn to the Temple of Psychic Youth, through an interest in Crowley or Wicca or, Robert Anton Wilson's kind of Jungian psychedelic mix.
Mm-hmm. I've kind of heard that said about chaos magic in general, that like it sort of serves as a sort of airport where people, or like a loading station where people will mess around and they'll find something that really works for them, and then that's what they'll kind of stick with. But I'm not sure if that's true for everybody, right? But yeah, I can see where the thinking is there for sure.
So I want to object to the temple being lumped with chaos magic, which I see happening increasingly. And the difference between the Temple of Psychic Youth and other chaos magic things is, if you look at Pete Carroll or you look at the Liber Null and Psychonaut, but a lot of those people came out of Thelema or some kind of Thelemic kind of thing, and then went, sort of deconstructed it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Topi idea was non-doctrinaire, was purely experimental and see what works. For example, one of the things in the Liber Null stuff, and Lionel Snell was the other person I was thinking of. And these are all great people, and I respect their work. That being said, I see them as being structuralists. They have banishings, they attribute the alphabet of desire to the Kabbalah, Spear's alphabet of desire to the Kabbalah. There's things about north is this and south is that, and here's what these things, mean. And we didn't have that at all. We called that the Museum of Magic, was that was an old thing that needed to be reevaluated and looked at with completely fresh eyes. And that's what we did. And there were folks who wanted to go in that direction. And it was a thing, there was a constant kind of back and forth about that. What is the Temple of Psychic Youth, or TOPY as we abbreviated it? And there was a lot of tension between folks that took a more structured approach and people that took a more deconstructive approach. And my thinking was that if folks wanted that structure, there were lots of organizations that had the opportunity for that kind of structure. And that our whole idea was to play with the idea of what if there are no rules or boundaries, and let's see where that goes. And so that's what I encouraged. And a lot of people wrote things for our newsletters and sent articles and essays about things that were very structuralist. And that was fine, and we would publish them. But we tried to create as much diversity of thought, or promulgate as much diversity of thought as we could. And I think North America being more distant from the UK, and also being more isolated from the chaos stuff, especially at first, early on. We're talking 1986 to 1991, 92 kind of time frame. And so a lot of that stuff was being published in the UK and not super accessible in the US during that time too. So does that help with?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So
our nickname for Pete Carroll's books were Lieber Doll and Psycho Drip.
That's not the first time I've heard that, actually. Very, very funny. So I'm kind of curious, like, just from a kind of like boots on the ground standpoint, what did Temple look like? Was it mostly like people doing work on their own and sending stuff in to be published? Were there big meetings? I'm guessing there weren't Discord servers back there where people hung out, but was there something kind of like that, like some kind of like a remote way that people were in communication? What did that kind of like look like from just a pragmatic standpoint?
Well, it was called the U.S. Postal Service for the most part. was our main way of communicating. The internet was towards the end, was just starting to come up in chat rooms and things like that. And, actual internet, it was just starting to move to what they called broadband, which I think was DSL lines at that time, which might have been 128 kilobits per second, not megabits. But most people were still dialing in with 54.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of stuff just being mailed, and like, were there meetings, people hanging out like in local areas or anything like that? Or?
Yes. So what we had the station, which was the North American kind of, you could see it as the capital of the Temple of Psychic Youth for North America, just as the UK temple was the capital, it was kind of the world capital. So it was kind of a matrix in a sense of, or a hub and spoke design, I think you could call it. So the hub was TOPY UK, and then there were two spokes that led out to the European and the North American stations. And then if people expressed an interest, they could ask to start an access point. And if they'd been involved for a while and we knew them through mail, and maybe had spoken on the phone a couple times, which was ridiculously expensive and couldn't happen very much unless you had a cheat code. But we would get to know people, or people would travel to us, or we would travel to them, meet them on a Psychic TV tour, or do road trips and stuff like that, and would run into each other. But anyway, people would start access points. So there was a Northern California one, a Southern California one, a Texas one. I think Canada was the first one out of Toronto. Those were the main ones, as I recall. There were others, and my apologies if any of them are listening. But those were the primary access points. So they would have kind of tribes built around them and would do things together and had very much their own identities. I mean, Toronto's a very different place from San Diego, and the character of that access point was reflected in the diversity of the people and the culture where those people lived. It was very much, just to say, so it was very much, there were some women involved, but most of the people involved were people of non-color and generally male. Definitely some LGBTQ.
Some queer folks.
Yeah, yeah, the rainbow. There were stripes in most of the rainbow. There weren't a lot of trans people, but there weren't a lot of trans people, period, then.
Mhm.
So there were more gay and lesbian people, but mostly male in general, male identifying folks at that time. And it was a pretty, I think Wicca was more at that time, the craft, so-called, was much more attractive to most women, and not for any particular reason. But it wound up, we had several women involved with Toby as it went on. But, I'd say 10% maybe of the members at that time were female. And some of that, I think, had to do with the demographic of, Psychic TV was initially kind of a guy thing. As they moved into techno, it became more interesting to women, I think. But it was a different
Yeah.
time.
I think it's also the case that, like, unless we sort of work really intentionally to cultivate inclusive spaces, the spaces that we cultivate, if we're not working against it, will sometimes end up mirroring whatever issues exist in the broader society in which we live, right? If we're not being conscious to fight against that. And so yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that, yeah, things like misogyny and racism and all that, persist in areas where you wouldn't like to see them, right? In your magical spaces, if you're not like really conscious about pushing against it. This is part of my experiment. Part of the idea of the experiment with White House is like, kind of trying to do this like really consciously, and we'll see how it goes, right?
Yeah. And we weren't real conscious back then, I have to say,
Mhm.
that, inclusivity wasn't really a phrase, and there weren't really tools to do that at that time in a way that you would now. It
Sure.
just wasn't a thing. And you'd notice, sort of look around and go, wow, I wonder why no black people are here. But part of that is because they didn't like the music, so they weren't exposed to it. And, I mean, the music wasn't exposing itself to them, And again, as it became more techno, it became more diverse. But that took a while too, because techno, the band itself started off as an industrial band, became kind of a psychedelic, like a hardcore psychedelic band, and then moved into acid house, early techno. But
Mhm.
early techno was like a white English guy thing pretty much too.
Yeah.
There weren't a lot of female DJs. There weren't a lot, and even though house music started off as a African American Chicago style, it was
Mhm.
appropriated by the Brits and kind of became a different thing. It's interesting how that has evolved over time, as an old guy.
Yeah, that is
And
interesting. And I think that it will continue to like change and everything. Like, I'm sure that I'll look back on many of the conversations that I've had on this podcast and, cringe a little bit at the things that I say, and as it should be, right? As we continue to learn more and hopefully, improve ourselves as people and as a society or whatever, like, shit's gonna change in terms of our perspective and stuff. And so I think just being willing to, always being willing to listen and try to do better in the future, I think is a good premise to operate from.
just being flexible
Mhm.
and being able to work within the zeitgeist of whatever you find yourself in, I think, and questioning that, always trying to push the envelope somehow, whatever, whenever, wherever it is. And that's always going to change and evolve. And, you're going to have to balance your principles, stretch your comfort zone as much as you can, And sometimes that isn't always in in a place that you're comfortable stretching. And hence, comfort zone exists anyway. I think that's a huge part of magic is challenging your comfort zone and your thresholds. And, whether it's conquering fear by jumping off of a bridge into a river or exposing yourself to magical or sexual situations that you wouldn't ordinarily find yourself in. And,
Yeah.
publicly making statements that you might not be comfortable making or that might
And
not be
I would agree with you. I would definitely put the caveat of like consent in here, right? Like there's this idea that like what we do consensually doesn't hurt us. And so like if you're the one that's pushing these boundaries for yourself and you're the one that's doing this stuff for yourself, you're the one in control. I think that yeah, like that's potentially like super fucking magically powerful. On the converse, if you're being like forced into this situation, that agency is being taken away from you and you're not having that opportunity to get that power from it. So I think there's that consent piece for me is really where that alchemy lies, which is why I'm so fucking obsessed with it. So yeah, fuck yeah.
the difficulty and some of the challenges that we face. So one of the ways that we would get together was by having campouts. And so annually, we had three during the 5 years that I was there. And what, 88, yeah, 88, 89, 90. And then there was another one. And there were some issues, especially with the one that I wasn't on. I mean, there's a few different things. There's coercion, which is kind of physically compelling somebody to do something.
Or if the
And then there's
situation, like it
also
can be coercion just because of like the political situation,
the
like, I'm your
peer
boss and you
pressure.
have to go on a date with me or I'm gonna fire you. Like that's also coercion, right? Like,
Right. Yeah. But I don't see that necessarily happening. I don't know. I mean, at least in my experience, there was always a door. And if you didn't want to, I mean, I had this metaphor kind of is it's like if there was a spinach eating club. Or we've got a spinach eating club and, it's all people that really aren't 100% comfortable eating spinach. And the whole idea is that we're going to all get together and we're going to eat spinach, and we're going to get over our spinach phobias and the trauma we have around spinach and just our general distaste for spinach, right? Or suspicion of spinach or discomfort of spinach. And so a lot of the time people would show up at the spinach club meetings and go, "Ew, they're eating spinach." And you're like, everybody's, feeling that way. And having somebody come in and say that, like, this is the spinach eating club. If you think spinach is absolutely disgusting and you're going to judge people or judge the organization for doing that, then you need to find another club
okay, so that sounds
because
kind
this
of
is
like what we would call like kink shaming. Like, you don't go into the like BDSM dungeon and like be like, "Oh, what are you doing? That's so gross." Or like even if you're not into it, like you don't this is a safe space for people to come and explore things and blah 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 blah. And like so I could see that, being like, "Well, this is what we're doing here and if that's not what you're into, then you don't have to be here either," right? Like
That's right. It's not just about the black leather suits, this is and the cool looking chains. This is actually people doing something with that stuff. Get out of here. If you don't if you're gonna make them uncomfortable doing what they're doing on your, based on your judgment. So we had some stuff like that. And we had some stuff that was, on one of the campouts, a lesbian couple showed up and we were doing these initiations basically where we were doing public sigils essentially where people weren't supposed to know exactly what was going to happen and they basically agreed to let anything happen to them during
okay,
that time.
raising a lot of red flags for me as a kinkster for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. But so I mean generally, I mean we did nice things to them and but there definitely was a lot of peer pressure for people to be involved,
Hmm.
for them to say yes. And the people that didn't say yes were sort of advised that they shouldn't be there.
Okay.
And
Hmm.
in hindsight, particularly this lesbian couple were completely uncomfortable with it. and were probably badly treated by most of us in a way that, would have the Temple of Psychic Youth canceled in about 5 minutes nowadays. And, I've always felt bad about the way that that was handled. But to be honest, I feel like nobody really had the vocabulary at that time to know what to do.
Sure, sure.
And we had some straight men there, and we had some straight women there. And I don't think anybody really knew how to have a conversation with them at
So if
that
you could
time.
kind of like go back in time and handle things differently, how do you think you would change the situation?
That's a hard question.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And also this was a long time ago and stuff. And these are also these type handling these types of situations are they require I'm learning like special skill sets. Like you can get training for handling consent incidents and shit like that, which is actually what I'm doing because I want to do this shit right. Right. The idea of accountability comes up so often in terms of like what separates abusive versus not abusive situations. So I think the more that we can do to be accountable for ourselves as individuals and as a community and all the rest of it, the hopefully the happier and better things will go for us.
I think asking them up front what they expected and having a conversation about what they expected versus what other people that were there expected, and to kind of to set their expectations better.
Okay, fair. Yeah, that's honestly, that's a really key component of consent, right? Is like, well, I can't agree to something that I don't know what it's going to be unless we're like in consensual non-consent territory, which is, for a lot of people, like play that you would do with somebody that you only knew like very well and trusted a lot, not, someone you just met or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah. But some of this was actually, I mean, kind of trust building
Mhm.
exercise. So what I want to do though is segue, if it's okay with you, is I want to go deep on this, but I
Sure.
also want to talk about, sort of what if, the leader, or the founder thinks of themselves as the leader? Because at some point, all the people left Denver, which was where I was running this out of at the time,
Right on. I'm from
or
Denver. Very
I
cool.
was coordinating, and I just couldn't do it anymore. There
Mhm.
was too much. I was starting to do projections. We went from, I'm 75 people on the mailing list to close to 2,000 people on the mailing list in five
Wow.
years. And
That's
I
a lot of
was,
work. Holy shit. Yeah.
I mean, and the thing is if you sent us a letter, we sent you a letter back, no
That's
matter
a
what.
lot of work.
And we sent, if you said, "Hi, I'm writing you," we would write back and say, "Hi, we're writing you back." And if somebody wrote a paragraph, we would sort of send them a paragraph back. I mean, obviously, if they were sent us 3 pages, we'd send them a paragraph or two back. But every single person that wrote us got a handwritten letter back, and got some kind of swag if they sent us a self-addressed envelope back,
That's so cool.
out to us. We sent back to them. That's how we had most of our communications.
Mhm.
And so there was, I mean, really like extended dialogues with some of these folks. Some of the stuff I still have, most of it I don't. Stuff that I saved was more with strangers who were sort of public figures. So when I quit, I decided that I didn't know who these things would end up with. There's people's sigils that they had sent us and the letters and all of that stuff. So I burned it all. I did a little ritual, sort of parting with these folks,
Makes sense.
and burned all of the sigils because that seemed like the ethical way to handle it. So anyway, I decided to stop doing it and passed it on to two other groups, to Southern California. And the idea was that Southern California would be the sort of Apollonian group that would do, or actually they'd be the Dionysian group that would do like the rituals and manage the sigil and the ritual part of it, the magical part, as it were. And then Texas would be the Apollonian group that would handle sort of the business and the finance and the publishing stuff. And Texas buckled under the weight of that fairly quickly because there was a lot to that. And I think
Yeah.
passed that stuff over to Southern California. So meanwhile, Genesis, the head of the thing, decided that it was done. There were too many people, that it was getting mainstream, and it was time to experiment with different things, and sent out a thing saying, basically, change priorities ahead, mission is terminated. And a lot of people said, no, it's not. Fuck you. It's
They're
not
like,
done.
well, just because you're done with it doesn't mean we're done playing with it or whatever. Okay.
Right. But then, I mean, it was tricky because it was Genesis idea. So there was a lot of there was an issue with that. And I was very close to both sides of that. And my suggestion was always, all you have to do is change the name, and change it to to the Church of Psychic Youth, to copy instead of Topi, and you're done. Like, then you can do your own thing. Use a different,
Mhm.
do a slightly different logo, which others have done. There's several groups that have used something extremely similar to the Psychic Cross for the symbol for the Temple of Psychic Youth
Mhm.
for many years, and they haven't gotten in trouble. And I'm pretty sure that those folks wouldn't have gotten in trouble. But they pressed the issue and said, no, it should be Topi, and we're going to continue to use this symbol because that's the symbol that we identify with. And then Genesis got grouchy, and lawyers came in, and injunctions and stuff like that. And there's an incredible amount of hard feeling about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I could kind of see
To
people
this
feeling
day.
hardly about that because it's like, on one hand, it's like, oh, this is supposed to be this like anarchic, experimental, no structure, and then all of a sudden we're getting sued or whatever. So it's a little
Right.
bit
And
of
I thought we
cognitive
were
dissonance
friends.
there for sure.
Yeah. And I thought we were friends and stuff like that. But I mean, I was trying to talk both sides off the ledge,
Hmm.
telling Jen that, like, so what? And, telling the breakaways, or the persistent people, like, just use a different name, use a different logo, and nobody would budge for a very long time. And it was very ugly
Magicians
and
tend to be a
very
rather
hard feeling.
fractious lot, don't we?
I don't know. I think everybody is,
Sure, sure,
actually.
sure.
The thing is that most things have, like, I mean, you can't do that with the PTA or Toastmasters or something like that, because it's an institution,
Hmm.
and you can't do that against institutions. You can't say, I mean, if you want to have a PTA, a Parent Teachers Association, you can't call it a PTA unless you pay the PTA to be in the PTA. And
Hmm.
so this was a very ad hoc, kind of informal group. And so, but you wouldn't dream of doing that with, I mean, with the OTO at this point, for example. I mean, you can get in a fight with them and leave, or, the Church of Satan, you can get in a fight with them and start the Temple of Set or whatever. But you wouldn't dream of calling it the Church of Satan, because whoever's in charge of it now, Xena or whoever, would stomp you. You get legally crushed. So I can see that side of it, but I can also see the side of, this was a pretty ad hoc anarchic group, and you should be able to kind of do what you want. And I don't know, it was tricky and very emotional for both sides.
Three, Romeo, two, two, four, Yankee, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec.
Greetings, it is I, Lexa from the future. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you're enjoying the episode so far. We'll be getting back to the rest of my chat with Tom Banger after the break here. After the interview, we're going to do a few listener mail and shout outs. But first, let me go ahead and give you an update about what we have going on with the Green Mushroom Project and Void House. Green Mushroom Project, which is an ongoing group magical working based on the metaphor of the relationship that some fungi share with some plants. In a nutshell, if we, the magical practitioners of Green Mushroom Project, are like a forest of trees, the Green Mushroom current connects us and strengthens us in unseen ways. In addition to this mycelial web, there is also the mushroom spores, which are a sort of celestial type of energy of this project. These are little packets of the current's energy which can be applied to situations as needed by participants. Our newest experiment, Void House, is about investigating the healing, alchemical, and other magical properties of consent. providing consent education to magically inclined people, and organizing consent-forward spaces for group work both in person and online, and some educational opportunities there as well. We have a lot of fun and free activities going on the Green Machine Discord server, home of the Green Mushroom, Hypho Sigil Project, and Void House. Join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats about a variety of magical topics, as well as special events like ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. We're collecting submissions for our third offering of compiled creativity, Fuck Around and Find Out Part 3, Sorceress Recipes for Resistance, Resilience, and More from the Green Mushroom Project. Deadline to submit is February 14th, Valentine's Day. See the details in the show notes. I've seen some tasty looking meals on Tom Banger's Instagram, and I'm guessing you have some fun stuff that you have going on in your magical practice or your kitchen or elsewhere. So please share that with us if you feel inclined. You can find the submission guidelines in the show notes, and the deadline is Valentine's Day, as I said, so don't delay. As always, much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. It's been such an honor and a privilege and a joy sharing this journey with you all and seeing how all this work has unfolded and continue to evolve both in our individual lives and sort of as a group. So fuck yeah and fuck yar. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com. Get me on Instagram for the time being at luxoccultpod, or on Blue Sky Social at Luxastrata, Luxastra, and you can hit me up for a link to that Discord server. Thanks so much to everybody who is making this show possible by giving on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and who is supporting it by spreading the word and telling your friends and posting about it and all of that stuff. It's all super helpful. So thank you so much to the people who are helping out with that. All right, so kind of returning back to the topic of today's episode at hand here. In the lead up of recording the conversation that you're hearing today, Tom mentioned something that really stuck with me. And so I'd like to pass it along here and share some thoughts about that. He noted that sometimes the only real initiation, a cult leader or a guru or whatever other person somebody looks up to, but like maybe shouldn't look up to, sometimes all that they can offer you in the way of magical discovery or understanding or whatever is the strength and personal power that, or whatever it is that you can gain by choosing to get the fuck away from that person or get past the harm that they've caused you or whatever the situation is. I have absolutely experienced this firsthand in a few occasions in my life, and although some of the experiences I've had with magical group work and other situations, jobs, other things, I mean, it's a jungle out there, right? But in magical work especially, is which I'm going to talk about since this is a show about occultism and everything. So although I've had some negative experiences with magical group work in spaces that I wasn't organizing, or with people who turned out to like not be very safe people, were pretty harmful and disappointing and frankly pretty like disgusting experiences to have, I can still be grateful for having had these experiences. Sometimes there's no way to understand what's going on with a thing than by like checking it out and experiencing it firsthand. This is one of the reasons that the occult is still occulted or hidden, even in the age of information. The books and the internet can only show you the maps. You sometimes have to go to the territory yourself through practice to actually see it. I'm definitely not advocating that people like put themselves in dangerous or shitty situations or whatever, like just to discover. Like that's definitely not what I'm saying. It's nuanced and complicated. I'm choosing to take what I can from these negative experiences here. So if I haven't had such gross experiences, I wouldn't have realized how crucial the component of consent was going to be to our work with Green Mushroom Project and Void House and all of it. And I wouldn't have found Consent Academy or any of the other awesome resources, and I wouldn't have had any of the dope experiences I had after all the bad stuff, you know, trying to like create a more functional way forward for modern group magic. Some of the faith in humanity I lost has been restored tenfold by seeing some of the cool work that people are doing and meeting folks who want to work in consensual spaces and do things where that is a central guiding principle. So I actually began this project of trying to introduce conversations about consent to another magical group, one in which I was not an organizer. This thing had formed after the North American part of a different thing imploded and a lot of people left because, from what I could gather, there were some issues related to consent. Basically, leadership not being able to hear the concerns of members surrounding stuff that would happen at gatherings. So I figured that a focus on consent would be a helpful solution for creating a better situation than the ones that these folks had left. definitely was trying to be helpful. Ironically, I ended up getting chased out of this group after having to report a consent incident to the leadership. It was all really sad and really dysfunctional, but it allowed me to see who around me was actually in alignment with me ethically. I had a conversation with a therapist once about my tangential involvement with the group that mostly fell apart, in which he asked me how much of my own personal ethics or morals or whatever I'd be willing to sacrifice to be part of that group. There were some abusive dynamics going on with my induction process, which he and I were analyzing together. I answered that I probably wouldn't really be willing to sacrifice much of my ethics or morals or whatever at all, like basically like none at all, actually. And after I answered that way, it really forced me to take a hard look to see if this was actually the case or not, or if I was doing this without being aware of it. We're social creatures, and being in groups is a basic survival need that we're adapted for. So I wouldn't hold that against myself or anybody else. But acting in ways that you're not actually consenting to or which don't align to your values can have the impact of being pretty traumatic. There's something called moral injury that can come into play, which we actually touch on in that trauma-informed practice presentation I mentioned earlier, and you can find that on YouTube. So to Tom's point about the only real initiation some of these cult leader or guru types or whatever have to offer is the strength that you gain through getting the fuck away from them. We can choose to, if we want, feel grateful for what we've been able to learn through those situations. Through my experiences that I'm talking about here, I was given the opportunity to make some important choices about how I want to move in the world and who I want my efforts to help. I've always had some people-pleasing tendencies, and this would have made it easy to shut the fuck up and put up and go along with things that I was not cool with just to get along with the people I was hanging around. It would have been easy to swallow my pride, hang my head, and allow myself and others to be totally shit on. But how could I go around talking about sovereignty of self and love of self and the rest of what's in the Green Mushroom Project Statement of Resistance while not actually walking that walk for myself in my own life? How could I sleep at night knowing I was setting the example for whoever might be looking to me, for example? As wild as it still sometimes seems to me, given what I do and everything, it also logically must be the case that this must be happening. That's a position of power. Like any position of power, it comes with a responsibility to those who are putting you in that position, and that's you all, the audience. So I have a responsibility to you, right? I can sort of boil it down this way. In working with the magical groups I mentioned, which you could also look at it as just being different factions of the same group, just given the circumstances, some of what I was asked to do would have infringed on my own personal autonomy and my sort of will as a magician. It would have made me less of a magician. So I didn't do it. I parted ways with pretty much everybody having to do with all of that situation. And I've been doing some cord cuttings and other types of like protection work and other shit like that to try to wash my hands of it. And things have been much better and much more chill ever since. I think there's still a lot to do in terms of taking accountability for some of the mistakes that I've made and harm that I've caused in my own organizing efforts and stuff, in terms of like maybe putting some unsafe people in positions of power. I've ignored some warnings that people have given me about people who I liked in the past, which is a really fucked up, horrible thing that I'm still sorting out, and just things like that. It's really challenging shit, and it's really difficult. So, I mean, I'm definitely not saying that it's done perfectly by me or anybody else, but I think all we can do is be willing to improve. If you've been harmed by somebody or something that you found on this show, I'm so sorry. My intention for making this thing and organizing Green Mushroom Project has been to allow people and myself to connect with things that will be useful and helpful. But it's a complex and sometimes dangerous world out there, and it's not always possible to predict what will result from a given action. And all one can do is learn and improve. It's also the case that people change. I've seen people undergo radical changes to their personalities and other things about them through using magical or psychological techniques, and this has been for better and for worse. Some of the activities that we do in our practices can be used to cause dynamic changes. That's like the whole fucking point, right? But this is rad if it's something that you want and it's being directed by you. But if it's something that somebody else or a group, whatever type of group, is telling you to do, then there's a possibility that it's also for the purposes of conditioning you to like buy into that situation or that group. Buy-in means that you're invested and will be less likely to leave. There are a few different flavors of power being played with in group magical settings and other places too, but we're talking about magic here. There's the various flavors of power that solitary practitioners will also experience from interacting with their own spirits, their gods, allies, their own team unseen, as I call it. There's also the flavors that arise from human-to-human social interactions and dynamics. It's the second area, this area of social power, that many people in these situations that I encountered seemed concerned with. Makes sense, though. As Aristotle said, humans are social and political animals. There's nothing wrong with playing with magical or social power. We all do it sort of all the time anyway. But to keep it from becoming situations where we're abusing the power that we're playing with, thereby putting ourselves and other people at risk of harm, and ourselves at risk of losing access to the power that we're playing with, consent needs to be at the center of that equation. This is what Void House is in the process of exploring. As I said, some of what I was asked to do would have made less of a magician out of me, so I didn't do it. Sure, I was kind of villainized and painted as a monster for stepping out of the, in my opinion, very gender-based role of putting up and shutting up that people thought I should be filling, or who maybe felt like it would be convenient for them if I filled. Working with Medusa helped me become pretty comfortable with being the monster, and then later, revisiting the devil card for the work that I did with Pink Disco magazine really kind of drove this home again. Non serviam. I'm happy to help willingly, and I'm not afraid of hard work. But twist my arm, press against my boundaries, try to force me to do something I'm not into, fuck around and find out. All right, fuck yeah. Let's go ahead and return to the rest of my conversation with Tom Banger. Lead you into that, I'm going to share a little poetry snack. This is very much related to some of what I just shared and is a sort of completed piece that was started throughout this journey, and the initiatory process that this all led me through kind of like led me to the conclusion that I came to with like the line of reasoning I was exploring with this piece. So yeah, gratitude for the insight. Through the void, our thoughts first touched, and she whispered to you the name of my birth. Now I wonder, will you discover all of the other secret syllables by which I am called? Would pulling this thread unravel the mystery which shapes me? Could the treasures of the heart be taken apart until we understand what we see? Yet the knowings of such a disassemblage are only half the story. Solve in light components and first principles dissolved. The next part is more tricky. Coagula. There is interiority. We come back to unknowing when we rebuild or are reborn anew. Fuck enlightenment. I want to become endarkened with you. And indeed, in darkness, I found what I had sought. You shifted and drifted until I knew you not. Lashing and biting and twisted, you turned, taking pieces of me until better I learned. The lesson you taught me, it finally stuck. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I have no dick for you to suck. Gratitude void. Alright, returning back to my chat with Tom Banger. We're going to hop in here as he's beginning to address some things related to consent, and then we're going to move on into all kinds of other interesting territory. There's still lots to explore. I hope you enjoy.
You know, some people feel like they were, some people feel like they were coerced in that group, and some people don't. And I'm not sure if it's a difference of their perspective or it's a difference of their experience. And I think a lot of people tend to feel pressured. I mean, when you have a conversation with somebody, sometimes they'll you can tell they're uncomfortable. And if you're compassionate or whatever, if you can read people well, there's another word for this, empathy. If you have the right empathy level, then you can tell that that person's uncomfortable having a conversation and you should, back off, right?
Hmm.
Just in conversing with a person on the street. I've seen this happen a lot where you're talking to somebody and they're kind of talking normal to you, but they're shaking. And you go, this person is shaking because they're uncomfortable talking to me.
Sure. Or somebody's backing away or things like that can, yes,
Right.
clue you in that this person's not into what's happening, right? Yeah.
Right. But that's just conversationally.
Hmm.
That's not even, like consensual conversation. That doesn't have anything to do with magic or anything. This is just like selling a plant to somebody at a farmer's market.
Yeah. I mean, it
And
comes up in all areas of life, honestly, like for sure.
yeah. So it's really, how do you codify that? How do you put it into your articles, as it were, of incorporation or, your mission statement or something that you're going to have the empathy to be able to, what do you call it? Like pull your horns in if somebody's not comfortable with it, right? Do you
Hmm.
do you create a safe word, so to speak, so that people it's a really tricky thing because I
Sure.
think a lot of the time, like a lot of the stuff that happens with a lot of these things is people go in and it's hero worship, right?
Sure.
And they get deeply involved with this community and they become very much part of it and they become very dependent on it because they might be, maybe not always, but maybe because they're dependent people in the first place, that they've been looking for this kind of somebody to tell them what to do. And then at some point they realize that the wrong person is telling them what to do, or they're being told things that they don't want to do, or they've changed their mind and they just want to do other things. And it's hard for them to come out of it because you've got the peer pressure. You're kind of locked in, you've got this kind of in IT, we call it vendor lock, where if you buy all Microsoft products,
Hmm.
then it's really hard to change, to
Sure.
switch over to Google because you're using Outlook and you're using Teams and you're using all this stuff. And how do you switch over? How do you move everybody to Mac if they're all on PC? And it's kind of it's analogous to the way that cults were. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry, that's really interesting. We see these things manifesting, right? Like these like traits that we would associate with cult-like groups or whatever, right? Like you were just describing. And I'm wondering to what extent do you think this stuff is like if we don't fight against it, do you think it just sort of self-organizes? Like this is just sort of part of what we sometimes do as humans is just form these social structures.
I think some people want that in their lives. And it might be, you can put it a bunch of different ways. Maybe it's people who are looking for a parent figure, some kind of missing structure in their life. Or there's people that are feeling aimless. And, that was when we first met Genesis, myself and this other guy who I'm not going to name, who were the original sort of founder people of it. And I'm not going to name him because they turned out not to be very good people and did some bad things to some children and
Ooh,
are sort of
yikes. Okay.
off,
Gross.
like they're kind of off the history book.
Okay, so
Um,
they've been they're written out of the will, as it were.
that's right. That's right. Written out of the true will. But so anyway, we were talking about it, like during the tour, meeting Genesis and watching him interact with people and things like that. And we were like, he's charismatic and, are we, zombies? Is he like Manson? And it's like, well, kind of the conclusion that we came to was, I don't know. Let's go along with what they do because it's more fun, more interesting to go along with what they're doing right now than it is to go along with what we're thinking of. Like they're thinking of more interesting things to do than we are. And we can leave when we want to. And that turned out to be true in this case,
Mhm.
you know? And you could kind of go in and out of Topi was the cool thing. I mean, it wasn't like, being punk and shaving your head on a mohawk and be like, oh, now I can't get a straight job until my hair grows out. And then if I go back to punk, I'll be a poser. I mean,
A
there
sellout and a
wasn't,
poser, yeah.
there wasn't that kind of thing at all. I get beaten up when when I go back to a show because everybody will think I'm a poser. Which was the thing back in the day, and that was a boys' club too, by the way. Punk rock was very much a boys' club back in the day, and there were some women there, and everybody, sort of, queercore came along and stuff, but they were kind of outsiders of the mainstream, air quotes scene back then. I mean, it's just the '80s were just a really different time culturally. I don't think people realize how
Sure.
very different it was and how hard it's been for some of us to get our heads around, the post-internet, world. Because I mean, that's what has transformed everything, I would say,
Mm.
is the ability for people to select their own communities and to set their own standards for those communities, and then find ways of broadcasting those standards to the rest of the world, in a sense, or to other communities, and getting other people to buy in to those values. All of a sudden, a lot of the things, look at Me Too, for example, that couldn't have happened without the internet. Black
Yeah,
Lives Matter couldn't have happened without the internet.
yeah. This conversation wouldn't be happening without the internet. Yeah,
True
totally.
that. Yeah. But it might have, because I might have sent you a letter
It's
and
true.
we might have started a dialogue that way. And that conversation, that person to person conversation, would still take place.
Mm.
And you, as a spoke, or no, you're a hub, you as a hub might decide to broadcast our conversation, with my consent, might decide to broadcast our conversation by mail in your next newsletter,
Okay.
or on your next video, or on the back of your next album, or whatever you were using as a broadcast platform at that time. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Okay.
It's
Yeah,
the
right on.
building of big communities, and then of those communities being able to radiate their values out in a way that they control,
Mm.
because that was another thing. The satanic panic happened during that time, so called. I called it the Satan scare, but it's a very catchy word. It ruined some lives and it was stupid, but I'm also not sure. I see a new one coming, by the
Oh, yeah,
way.
absolutely. Yeah, people are gearing up for it right now.
I just found out that LOL stands for Lucifer our Lord, not laugh out loud.
Oh, interesting. Did you
I'm
learn that
using
from
it
a
all
brightly
the
colored
time.
meme or on a website that had a green background and red writing or something?
I don't know. I just saw it on Facebook someplace. Like somebody
Okay.
posted LOL stands for
Uh,
Lucifer our Lord. So I'm using it all the time because
Facebook is a great source for things, information such as that.
okay, boomer. Well, as a I'm on the cusp of boomer and Gen Xer. Like I was born in '62, and so that's right, sort of at the age where boomer and Xer converge.
Okay.
So I kind of have an interesting, different perspective on things than either one of those generations does. But, almost all of my friends are Facebook only. Like they don't understand um, Instagram, much as I don't understand Zoom, or not Zoom, Discord.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's there's a million of these things out there. There honestly, there's only you have to sort of like pick your battles, at least for me, because there's not an infinite amount of time for me to be messing around with all this stuff anyway. And yeah, it's honestly the complexity of it is kind of nightmarish. But sorry, I'm
Yeah,
getting us onto an existential tangent of dread here. Apologies.
that's okay. But so, I mean, one of the things that you posed in the initial thing about this was about like the idea of in charge, of who's in charge and how to be in charge in an ethical manner.
Mhm.
I think, how to manage something or guide it without being without being overbearing. And that's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
because we have expectations and we also have different personality types where some people are very soft, very light touch, and some people tend to be, more forceful about getting what they want
Hmm.
or about, their expectations. And I don't know. I mean, I was just reading this thing about that kind of brought that to a head for me in a way, which was, I heard somebody was talking about how patriarchy's got to go. We need to move towards a more matriarchal system. And, I just started thinking about archies, and the whole, really one of the big problems to me with humans is that we have too many archies. We've got monarchies and patriarchies and matriarchies. Well, democracy came because monarchy wasn't working. And I'm guessing that, you know, matriarchy was there and somebody, a bunch of people were just like, these people don't know what they're talking about anymore. It's not relevant for the way that things are now. We're gonna do this in this other way,
There's
And
actually a
now,
really interesting book about this called Dawn of Everything. If people are
oh yeah,
interested,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, because that's
yeah.
a really cool
David Graeber, he's my hero.
yeah. And so yeah, I think and then we it also I think what's cool about that is it does challenge some of our assumptions about history too, because we do have this like narrative about history of like, oh, this is just how it goes, right? Like we
Yeah,
just develop into cities and blah 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 blah, and that's not at all
yeah,
anthropologically the case when we actually look at it.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think what you're touching on here is that like, I do think that there have been other ways that we've done things in societies in the past, and there's no reason that we need to be like locked into this one mode of thought that we seem to have been cul-de-saced into. Um,
but I'm just getting tired of people telling me what to do. Like, I want no anarchy. Is don't let not anarchy, but let me decide who I want to listen to, you know? And don't fucking tell me how to live my life. Don't tell me what to do. Let me make my own choices because you, as an intelligent, compassionate human being, trust me to make good decisions,
mm,
or you as a leader, as the person who's running, as the group or the elite or whatever that's running the police force, which we probably need,
mhm,
or
mm,
the border wall, which I'm not going to say anything about, or
yeah,
Gaza or whatever. Like, you should trust me to make good, ethical, forward-looking decision. And if you don't, then you don't deserve to be my boss.
sure, sure. And I think that yeah, this component of trust, like civil trust, is something that comes up in these discussions in terms of like people's confidence in their government and the government's confidence in the
Right.
people.
Or
And
they're called.
yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, you can kind of look at this, in terms of any type of like leadership. Yeah, okay, sorry, I feel like I interrupted your train of thought here, though.
Well, just at some point, like for a cult, for to go to take this back, at some point, the cult has to have some kind of standards and
Mhm.
be like, we are this, like a Venn diagram, as it were, of the two circles with the shaded
Yeah,
area.
this is
Like,
our deal.
this is the thing we are, and this is the thing that we're not.
Sure.
And if this isn't the thing that you want, then you should find something that is more like what you want. If you have some suggestions, here's the suggestion box, right? And let's have a positive discussion about, is this a thing that is in our Venn diagram or should be in our Venn diagram, or is it something that shouldn't be? And
Mhm.
if it's something that shouldn't be, then get the fuck out of here. Like,
Sure. And
go
also
join
if
something that's for you.
yeah, and if you can't also adhere to the behavioral expectations that we've agreed to as a group, then get the fuck out. Like that's been
That's
an
right.
issue that I've seen crop up in a lot of different circumstances. How do you sort of like healthily get rid of if it's like an ecosystem or a body or something like that, there needs to be a way of getting rid of things that are causing issues. So I think that's another component that is going to be important in, keeping things
Yeah.
chill.
Yeah, white blood cells.
Yeah, exactly. There needs to be some kind of a immune system response to problematic things.
Well, I mean, that's one of those things, right? Is it's kind of a bylaws thing. I mean, this was a huge thing. I don't know if you've read Jim Wasserman's autobiography called Into the Fire.
I have not.
so he was part of, I don't know how OTO literate you are, but the history of it is really interesting from a cult perspective. Like
Mm.
all of these, like when I was doing Toby, I was really interested in the way that cults worked. I read books about bikers and I read books, about the Hells Angels, and I read books about the mafia, and I read books about the Deadheads, and I read books about the OTO. Well, I've already knew a lot about the OTO, but like the process church, like the way that that disintegrated is really interesting. Scientology, like the way that it
Oh
worked
God, so yeah, fascinating stuff. I'm
is,
I'm also fascinated by this topic.
but so the OTO, had all of its schisms and stuff during the Crowley days and everything like that. And then this guy Marcelo Moda. So there were people in California. There was Grady McMurtry's California OTO, and then there was Kenneth Grant's crazy Typhonian OTO that was going off on its, like left-hand path kind of thing. And then there was this guy Marcelo Moda in Brazil who started a thing called, I think he called it the OTO too, and then he might have called it the AA, but he started reprinting Crowley books and did very, like for that time, for the late 70s, early 80s, did very, very nice collections with footnotes and comments, and did a really good job sort of compiling some of the books. And he put out like 4 or 5 things. He did a crazy version of Magic Without Tears
Hmm.
in 2 or 3 volumes. But anyway, him and the California OTO got in a fight, and Wasserman started off being part of the Brazilian OTO of the Moda group, and then realized that the guy was out of his mind and a control freak, and then was actually going to the California OTO to try and like reconcile stuff on behalf of Moda, and then went back, and Moda threw all this like hate at him. Like apparently the California OTO made some very reasonable suggestions about the way that they could split the OTO between each other and continue. And Moda refused, saying that he was the only person that had the right to. So they wound up going to court, and the California OTO won, and now that is the OTO writ large. But Wasserman's autobiography talks about that, and then talks about how chaotic and sort of anarchic the original OTO was. And it was like lots of drug addicts and lots of stuff going on with that. And sort of Wasserman himself had some drug issues at the time. It's a great book. It's a really good read. It's compelling, and he's very vulnerable in it. He doesn't pull any punches about mistakes that he himself made and about his own addictions and demons that he had to deal with. But it's a great story of sort of the growing pains of a magical organization too, and just how, cullings happen, consolidations happen, and stuff like that. I highly recommend it from the standpoint of where, you're trying to go right now.
Right
It's
on.
probably
Thank
the
you.
best account
Okay.
of such an endeavor. And of course, it's much more structured than what you're trying to do. So in some ways, it's easier because you could say, we're going to have these types of rights, and they're going to be like this, and we're not going to do this, and we're not going to do that, because that's, because they're essentially a Catholic church, if you really think about
Yeah,
it.
it's very similar in many ways.
Well, no,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
It's a Gnostic Catholic church. They have masses. They have,
Yeah,
it's
I was
done.
just talking to David Shoemaker about this actually. I was like, in terms of like a religious perspective and all that. And so yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, a lot of the people in that are bishops, the EGC, the Ecclesiasta Gnostica Catholic or something, is directly, part of,
Mm.
or brethren or sister to that organization.
Okay.
I don't think I'm talking out of turn by saying any of those things.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. This is outside of my wheelhouse here.
Yeah, no, but just in terms of talking about the relationships and things like that, I think those are accurate depictions of the way
Sure.
things, of the what was put in that book, and also sort of about the relationship between OTO and EGC.
Okay,
And,
right on.
Gnosticism and Catholicism, they don't believe in Jesus. They believe the in something else. I'm not exactly sure. For example, Jim wrote a book about Masonry, about Masonic memorials in DC, and in there specifically said he can't be a Mason because he doesn't believe in Jesus.
Hmm.
And that's part of being a Mason. Yeah. And you can't be Catholic and be a Mason either.
Oh, really? Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, they have their own thing. That's why the Knights of Columbus were invented, was to create a quasi-Masonic organization that didn't challenge the Pope's authority.
Oh, okay. The Pope's authority. I see. Okay. Is it that the Masons won't let you be Catholic, or that the Catholics won't let you be a Mason?
The Catholics won't let you be a Mason.
Okay, that sounds more that makes more sense. I was like, I know a few Masons and they seem really chill, but like I know it's also this huge institution and my friends aren't the ones making the rules or whatever, obviously. But yeah.
Yeah, but there is a piece about there is a clause that to go to the second level of it, whatever that is. I don't know much about it,
Sure.
but to get to, it's like a video game, I guess, right? To get to the second level, you have to you become a knight of the Rosy Cross.
To beat the boss, you have to meet Jesus.
That's right.
So I'm looking at the time here, and thank you so much for being willing to, spend your time and giving me this awesome information and advice. And, it's been really interesting hearing about this history and your experiences and everything. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind maybe giving me some parting words of advice.
Don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
Okay.
That was a joke. But
Well, I feel like that's also good advice. I mean,
yeah,
don't do something that you're not willing to be accountable for.
so a couple of things that people have told me over the years. One of the ones that sunk in the most is that people are not hamburgers. They're not the same, and they can't be assembled or sold or distributed in the same way, that one would do hamburgers. And a lot of the time, people will take, kind of a hamburger approach to groups of humans, and I think that is really a crucial thing. Especially when you start scaling up, it's really hard not to try to automate your human relations, and you can't do that and stay magical.
I love it. Fuck yeah. Thank you so much. Well, you have a podcast, you have some other stuff going on. Is there anything you want to let the listeners know about? And also, where
But
can
did
they
I want
find
to
your work?
plug?
Yeah.
Not really. I'm trying to do as much as I can. I've got a Banger and Angry Andrew podcast, and I don't know, I write stuff. I've got a thing coming out in Fenris Wolf. I've never published anything independently ever,
Okay.
of just me. And honestly, I think people use their platforms way too much to promote products, not ideas. And I'd really like to see people promoting ideas, like not monetizing as much as they do. And so I'm trying to do that, is to promote thoughts and not sell thoughts.
Yeah, I love that. Right on. Well, Tom, thank you so much for spending the time talking with me today. This has been really great. And yeah, I really appreciate all these perspectives and hearing all this interesting history and everything.
Thanks for giving me a microphone.
Well, fuck yeah. Thank you so much. All right, thanks so much to Tom Banger for joining me. Check out the show notes for links to Tom's podcast and social media stuff, and check out the full show notes. There will be a link to that in the description to see the list of books we talked about today, as well as the resources I mentioned regarding unpacking cult stuff and all of the rest of it. I found our conversation today really helpful and interesting, and I hope that you all enjoyed it too. Even though it took me a little while to release the conversation on the podcast, as you might have noticed from the date I gave at the beginning of the interview, it feels more timely than ever, actually. One message which Topi hits on often in their work, and which resonates very strongly with me, and I know a lot of others too, has to do with the power that art and magic and eroticism and things like this can have in the face of the messages coming from authoritarian sources. What Topi might have referred to as control, or perhaps one facet of it. And now, adding in this new component of consent to the mix makes us feel even more powerful, as authoritarianism typically functions through fear and coercion and force, not very consenty things. The topic of consent seems pretty poisonous to authoritarianism in many of its mutations. So the more ideas about consent we can pour into the well of our current cultural thinking and conversations about stuff, the better, in my view. There's a link in the show notes to a recording of a presentation I gave last summer when we were doing our 23 Bibliomancy chats, in which we discussed some intersections of influence techniques and cults and politics and things like that. Definitely some relevance and intersection with what we talked about in today's episode. One topic that comes up in a lot of that discussion is how effective the fear of hell has been as a means of controlling people's thoughts and behaviors. There were some people there the night that we did the chat who spoke about their own experiences and journey with unpacking the idea of hell, which is something that comes up for a lot of folks in these kinds of circles. We also talked about the BITE model, BITE, which stands for Behavior, Information, Thoughts, and Emotions. This is a model of control that Dr. Stephen Hassan created, and he's a former Moonies cult survivor. He also created something called the influence continuum, which we take a look at. And we look at some famous experiments from the history of psychology, some of which have been debunked, which we discuss, and much more. It's a fun time. So thanks so much to the Pocket Wizards who showed up for that and for their generosity with sharing the thoughts and experiences on the topics of influence, politics, cults, and more. So speaking of which, let's go ahead and do listener mail and shoutouts. Shout out and much love to all the Pocket Wizards and Mush Rotters. I've really been enjoying our conversations in Subversive Book Club and elsewhere lately. There's a lot of cool things going on about magic, resilience, just a lot of inspirational stories which have brightened dark days, or what seem to be dark days. Who knows? Everybody's got a different experience going on, and who knows what will be going on when you hear this. So perhaps they are not dark days, but regardless, there is plenty of space to share about what we're up to artistically in our fitness practices or whatever else we've got going on, which I really appreciate, so thank you. All of you continue to fucking impress and humble and amaze me, so gratitude. Stay strong and continue to resist. Fuck yar. Shout out to Candy, keep kicking ass. Shout out to Spore Guy and everybody there, thank you for your help. Gratitude to everybody who's going to be sitting in on our upcoming peer discussion panels about maintaining balance in one's magical practice, parsing out the positive and negative types of magical thinking and magical thought and more. Based on the discussions that we've had leading up to this thing, I think it's going to be really fucking rad and offer some really interesting and helpful perspectives. So thank you all in advance for that. I was reflecting back on the stuff I shared earlier in the break about some of my experiences stuff, and I did want to note that it wasn't everybody who is horrible or anything like that. It was really more about the dysfunctionality of the situation itself. And there are a couple of people that definitely stand out as being exceptions to the pattern. And I just want to say, if any of you are listening, I really appreciate you being able to treat me like a human in those circumstances. And I respect the ethical fortitude that you showed. Thank you. Shout out to June. I love the idea of giving these potential partners a bit of reading to make sure that everybody's on the same page before diving into things. Fuck yeah. The episode about the 5 pillars of consent with Zach Budd from the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom and Lonnie Scott from Weird Web Radio to talk about inclusive heathenry is now available on the Lux Occult YouTube. That's number 48. You might have already heard it on another platform, but it is now up on YouTube for those who wish to see their podcast there. You can also hear the co-directors of the Consent Academy in episode 88. Thanks to everybody who has reached out and who's been supporting the show by rating, reviewing, and giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Your support is a big part of why this podcast is being made. Thank you so much for making it possible. Whether or not it was featured, know that all the missives I receive are appreciated, nay, cherished. I mean, unless they're rude, but that happens very rarely, so I appreciate that as well. If you'd like to send me thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations, you can find me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, on Blue Sky at Luxastrata, Luxastrata, and for the time being, you can find me on Instagram at Lux Occult Pod. Hell yeah. If you like the show and you like what we've got going on over here, you can support it on Patreon, like the kind and generous people who I mentioned who are already doing so. This will entitle you to receive a Bibliomancy reading from me. Making the show is, of course, a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one person, but it means a lot to me to be able to do it. Thank you so much to the people who are making that possible by giving on Patreon or buy me a coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. Tell all your friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet at the next ceremonial potluck you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. Both of these things are super helpful, so thank you so much to those who are doing so. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button so you can get updates when a new episode comes out. Quick programming note here. Lots of cool stuff coming your way in this new year. I spoke with Paul Wilde about his biography of Jim Morrison, which looks at the life of Jim through the lens of him being somebody on a sort of like interesting spiritual journey. I read a lot of Jim Morrison's poetry as a young person, and I think it had a big impact on the way that I ended up writing poetry. It was really cool getting into his life with Paul Wilde. I also had a very fun conversation with my brother about the mythology and J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and there's other very cool stuff coming your way besides that. I wanted to mention that episode number 75, Psychoanalysis and the Cut-Up Technique with Dr. Vanessa Sinclair and Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist with Derek Hunter, would be a good companion to this one. We do talk about some of the things very much related to Topi's work, like the cut-up method in there. And Dr. Sinclair shares some thoughts about Genesis Peerage and other things like that, so that would be a nice companion to this one. Another one that I think would go nicely with it is number 70, Spinoza and the Sexy Dangers of Pantheism, Transdivinity, and Agdistis with Rocket. A couple final thoughts before I bid you all a fond farewell here. Sort of coming back to the idea of the timeliness of today's conversation, but I think this is also an evergreen thing. This idea that Topi had about the power that art and magic and eroticism can have, the importance that their work has had on the magical, social, and artistic landscapes will continue to be perhaps even more relevant in the days to come, as, will we see what happens here where everybody's buckling up? I think it's the case that although the temple technically isn't around anymore, the work they started or perhaps picked up, it's hard to say where anything actually starts or ends, right? But it doesn't really matter because the work will continue on. This is what Team Unseen tells me, at least. The work will continue because it must continue. Whatever it means for you in your life and your practice, let me remind you to resist as I share the Green Mushroom Project statement of resistance. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thanks so much to Tom Banger for joining me. Check out the show notes for the links to all the awesome stuff that we talked about today and for those resources I mentioned and everything. Thanks so much for all the kind words and support for the show and my other work. Fuck yeah, I really appreciate the kindness, y'all. I appreciate all the help and support from the unseen sources as well. Gratitude, Void, and Hail Hecate. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Estrada, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. Let's go out with gratitude, Void. If you want to find us, you can endless impurity, infirmity, pain, plague, poison, madness, manipulation, or predation that restrains me. I'm now free to pick up the pieces and move on to something much better and much brighter. If you want to find a tough road, but I'm very, very happy to finally shut it in the house there on this dark chapter. I finally get it. I can't fucking wait for anybody else to give me permission. I just have to fucking do it myself. It took me long enough. Gratitude, Void.